Imagine this. A family vanishes from their home without a trace. Police search for weeks. The case goes cold. Years pass. The house sits empty, gathering dust, until one day, the lights flicker on again. Curtains shift. Shadows move across the windows. Neighbors swear they see the missing family inside. Same faces, same clothes, same dog. But here's the problem. DNA proves it is the family, the one that disappeared 25 years ago. And they claim they never left. If you're drawn to stories where truth blurs with nightmare, where unsolved disappearances refuse to stay buried, make sure you subscribe. October 1995. The Dawson family disappeared on a Sunday afternoon. They had eaten lunch at their church potluck, stayed to chat with friends, and driven home in their tan Ford Windstar. Witnesses confirmed it. Several neighbors saw them pulling into their driveway just after 2 p.m. Their collie, Ranger, barked from the back seat, tail wagging against the window. By Monday morning, the Dawsons were gone. The house stood open, front door unlocked. A casserole dish from the church sat on the counter, untouched. The television flickered with static in the living room. The collie was found whimpering in the backyard, hungry but unharmed. No signs of struggle. No signs of forced entry. Nothing missing. The investigation consumed the small town of Bramblewood, Texas. Volunteers combed the woods. Police dredged the river. Flyers papered telephone poles. But weeks turned to months, months to years, and the Dawsons became just another cold case. 4 faces on a fading poster. The house was sold, resold, and eventually foreclosed. By the early 2000s, it was boarded up, the yard choked with weeds. Teenagers dared each other to sneak inside, whispering that the Dawsons' spirit still lingered. And then, in the spring of 2020, something happened that no one could explain. The house lit up again. Curtains opened. Fresh paint covered the shutters. The lawn was mowed. And one by one, neighbors began to swear that the Dawsons, the same parents, the same children, the same collie, had moved back in, unaged, unchanged, as if 25 years had never passed. The first neighbor to notice was Evelyn Mayfield. On March 12, 2020, she stepped out onto her porch with a mug of coffee and saw movement across the street. The Dawson house, a place that had been silent for nearly 25 years, now had lights glowing in the upstairs windows. She froze, mug halfway to her lips. For years, Evelyn had avoided looking at the house. It was bad luck, people said, to stare too long at the windows. A shadow might stare back. Kids from the high school broke in sometimes, leaving graffiti on the walls or beer cans in the basement, but the house itself had always seemed resistant to being occupied again. Realtors gave up trying. Owners abandoned their plans. It was a cursed address, plain and simple. But this morning, Evelyn saw lace curtains fluttering in the open window of the master bedroom. Fresh curtains, not the yellowed ones she remembered from the 90s. At first, she thought maybe a developer had finally bought the property. Maybe they were fixing it up to sell. But then, as she stood at the end of her driveway, she saw a shape move across the glass. A woman, slender, dark-haired, passing by the window as if adjusting the curtains. Evelyn's mug rattled against her saucer. She set it down quickly before she dropped it. It wasn't possible. The Dawsons were gone. Everyone knew that. She found herself walking closer, almost against her will, her slippers whispering against the pavement. From the corner of her eye, she caught another movement, this time downstairs. The living room lamp clicked on, casting a warm glow against the street. She could see into the room clearly now, the armchair in the corner, the floral couch, furniture that hadn't been there when the bank boarded the place up years ago. And sitting on the couch, knees tucked up, hair in a loose braid, was a teenage girl. Evelyn's heart skipped. It couldn't be. The girl looked exactly like Anna Dawson, But Anna would be in her 40s now, not 15. Evelyn backed away slowly, almost stumbling on the curb. She didn't remember going back inside, only that later she was sitting at her kitchen table with her phone in her hand, debating whether to call her son or the police. In the end, she called no one. She told herself she must have imagined it, a trick of the light, too much wine the night before. But that night, when she looked again, the Dawsons' porch light was on, and from then on, Bramblewood began to whisper again. Detective Aaron Holt didn't believe in whispers. He believed in paperwork, evidence, long hours, and the slow grind of facts. At 47, he had the weary posture of a man who had spent too much of his life in fluorescent-lit rooms and funeral parlors, telling people things they didn't want to hear. He'd grown up in Bramblewood. He remembered the Dawson case well. In 1995, he'd been a rookie officer, barely 22, tasked with standing guard at the Dawson property while investigators searched inside. He remembered the smell of that casserole on the counter, already turning sour. He remembered the dog scratching at the back door. And he remembered the hollow, bone-deep chill of walking through a house that felt like it had just been emptied minutes before. Now, 25 years later, the chief wanted him back on it. "We've had reports," the chief said, sliding the file across Holt's desk. "Neighbors say the Dawsons are back. Same faces, same kids, even the damn dog. You've got history with the case. Go take a look." Holt had stared at him. "Chief, with respect, this sounds like hysteria. People cooped up too long, seeing things they want to see." "Maybe," the chief said. "Or maybe something stranger. Either way, we need eyes on it." So here he was, parked across the street in an unmarked sedan, watching the Dawson house through the rain. It was March 15th, 3 days after the first report. The sky was low and gray, drizzle streaking across his windshield. Through the blur of rain, the house looked alive in a way it hadn't for decades. Porch light glowing, curtains open, lawn freshly cut. At 7:14 p.m., the front door opened. Holt leaned forward. A man stepped out onto the porch, tall, square-shouldered, with neatly combed hair and a pressed shirt. He carried a trash bag, tied neatly at the top. He walked down the steps, crossed to the curb, and dropped it into the garbage bin. For a moment, the man turned his head, scanning the street. Holt froze. It was Thomas Dawson. The same Thomas Dawson who had vanished in 1995. The same face Holt remembered from the missing posters. He looked unchanged. Maybe a few new lines near the eyes, but not enough for 25 years. And then Holt saw something else. A collie bounded out onto the porch behind Thomas, barking once before sitting obediently by the door. Ranger. Holt felt his mouth go dry. He reached for his camera, snapping several photos quickly. Thomas turned back, gave a low whistle, and the collie trotted inside. The door shut. The porch light clicked off. Holt sat there for a long time, rain dripping steadily, photos cooling on his camera screen. There was no rational explanation, but the Dawsons were back. By the next morning, word had spread beyond whispers. Teenagers rode their bikes past the house in groups, daring each other to get closer. Cars slowed as they drove down Maple Street, drivers craning their necks. Online forums picked it up, first local, then regional. One grainy cell phone photo of Anna Dawson, or the girl who looked like her, sitting on the porch went viral on Twitter. The caption read, "How does she look exactly the same?" People dug up the old case, posting scanned copies of the missing flyers, linking to archived newspaper clippings. Hashtags trended. The Dawsons, it seemed, had returned not just to Bramblewood, but to the world's attention. And Detective Holt, who had sworn off unsolved mysteries decades ago, found himself staring into one again. The official knock came on March 20th. Holt stood on the porch of the Dawson home, his hand raised to the freshly painted door. Behind him, patrol cars idled at the curb, lights flashing silently. He wasn't sure what he expected. A barricade, a denial, maybe even silence. Instead, the door opened smoothly. "Good morning, officer." It was Thomas Dawson again. Calm, polite. Behind him, the living room looked warm and ordinary. A couch, a lamp, a bookshelf lined with framed photographs. A family home. "My name's Detective Holt," Aaron said, keeping his voice even. "I'd like to ask you a few questions." Thomas smiled faintly. "Of course. Why wouldn't you?" Detective Holt stepped into the Dawson house as though crossing a threshold into another reality. The air was warm, faintly scented with lemon cleaner. The walls were painted a fresh eggshell white. Photographs lined the hallway, the kind you'd expect in any suburban home. Family portraits, holiday gatherings, a dog in a Santa hat. Except the photos were wrong. They were the same photographs Holt remembered from 1995. He'd seen them in the original case file, even handled a few when evidence techs cataloged the Dawson home all those years ago. In one frame, Anna and Caleb Dawson stood on the front lawn with Ranger, their collie, holding sparklers. Another showed Thomas and his wife, Elaine, seated at the kitchen table with a birthday cake between them. The photos were identical. Same clothes, same hairstyles, same smiles, frozen in time. But the frames looked new, as though someone had replaced them recently. "Please," Thomas said, gesturing toward the living room. "Come in. Would you like some coffee?" Holt shook his head. "No, thank you." His hand brushed the edge of his holster as he walked past Thomas. Not intentionally, just a nervous reflex, his body reminding him that this situation defied every training manual he'd ever read. Elaine Dawson appeared from the kitchen. She wore a pale blue blouse and jeans, her dark hair pulled back in a neat twist. Her face matched every missing poster Holt had ever seen. She smiled warmly. "Detective," she said. "It's been such a long time since we had company. Sit, please." Holt's mouth went dry. He remembered interviewing Elaine's mother the week after the disappearance. The woman had clutched her rosary until her fingers bled, repeating over and over that her daughter would never abandon her children. Holt had believed her. Now Elaine stood in front of him, unaged, unchanged. He lowered himself onto the couch, his eyes sweeping the room. The furniture was clean, ordinary. A half-completed jigsaw puzzle covered the coffee table. Ranger lay on the rug, tail thumping lazily. And then Holt noticed the children. Anna sat in the armchair, her braid draped over one shoulder. She looked exactly as she had in the school portrait that had circulated in 1995. Bright eyes, freckles across her nose. Next to her, Caleb leaned against the armrest, fiddling with a Rubik's Cube. He looked no older than 8. Holt's chest tightened. Caleb should be 33 years old. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the soft ticking of a mantel clock. Finally, Holt cleared his throat. "Mr. Dawson, Mrs. Dawson, where have you been?" Thomas smiled faintly, as if amused by the question. "Home, of course. This house has been empty for 25 years. Holt kept his tone measured. You and your family were reported missing in October of 1995. Do you understand that?" Elaine's smile didn't falter. "Detective, we've never been missing. We've always been here. People must have misunderstood. Holt leaned forward. "We found your dog alone in the yard. The casserole left on the counter. Your bank accounts untouched. There were searches, vigils, investigations. Your parents, they died without knowing what happened to you." Elaine's eyes flickered, just for an instant, as if a shadow passed behind them. Then her smile returned, serene and steady. "People grieve in different ways," she said softly. "Sometimes they imagine the worst." Holt looked at Thomas. "And you? You're telling me you never left? That for 25 years you've been, what, sitting in this house?" Thomas's smile thinned. "Detective, I don't appreciate the insinuation. My family and I live quiet lives. We don't seek attention. Holt stared at him, trying to read the truth behind those calm, unwavering eyes. Behind him, the children whispered to each other. He caught fragments, Caleb's voice, light and quick. Don't say anything. Anna's in reply. He doesn't understand. Ranger barked once, sharp, startling. The collie rose, ears pricked, staring at Holt as though warning him. Holt stood slowly. I'll need to follow up. There will be questions. People will want answers. Thomas nodded once. Of course. You're only doing your job. Holt turned toward the door, every instinct screaming at him that nothing in this house was what it seemed. As he stepped outside into the cool March air, he glanced back once. Through the window, he saw the Dawsons standing together in the living room, 4 figures framed in warm light. They looked like a photograph brought to life. Too still, too perfect. And in that moment, Holt understood why the neighbors had whispered. The Dawsons were back, but they didn't belong. Later that night, Holt sat in his office at the Bramblewood Police Department. The photographs he'd taken spread across his desk. The images were sharp, undeniable. Thomas at the curb with the trash, Elaine at the window, Anna on the porch, Caleb playing in the yard, all of them exactly as they had been in 1995. He rubbed his temples. His first instinct was fraud. Imposters. A family planted to stir hysteria, maybe part of some twisted scam. But the problem was DNA. The state lab had rushed results after samples were collected from the Dawsons' trash. A soda can, a paper napkin. The report had come back that afternoon. Matches confirmed. Thomas Dawson, Elaine Dawson, Anna Dawson, Caleb Dawson. Probability of error, less than 1 in 1 billion. It made no sense. DNA didn't lie, but people did. Holt leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He thought of the children's whispers, the collie's bark, the way Elaine's smile had never wavered. Something was wrong inside that house, something that went beyond missing persons, beyond cold cases, and he was going to find out what. 2 streets away, Evelyn Mayfield sat at her kitchen table, blinds drawn. She had seen the patrol cars outside the Dawson house earlier, seen Detective Holt knock on the door. For a while, she'd felt relief. Maybe the police would finally explain what was happening. But then, just after midnight, she'd looked again. Through the gap in her blinds, she saw the Dawson living room across the street. All 4 of them were standing there. Not moving, just standing, for hours, watching, waiting. Detective Aaron Holt arrived at the Bramblewood Library the next morning, his shoulders stiff from a sleepless night. He hadn't told the chief everything. He hadn't told anyone about the way the Dawson children whispered when they thought he wasn't listening, or the way Elaine's eyes had flickered when he mentioned her parents' deaths. He needed records before theories. The library was quiet, the kind of silence only old paper could hold. He signed the ledger, nodded at the librarian, and headed for the microfilm machines in the basement. For 2 hours, he scrolled through yellowed pages of the Bramblewood Gazette, the paper that had covered the Dawson case in exhaustive detail during the autumn of 1995. Headlines blurred. Local family missing. Community stunned. Dawson's search enters 3rd week. No leads. Vigil draws hundreds to Maple Street. The photos were the worst. Elaine's smile on a church directory portrait. Thomas in his crisp button-down, holding Anna on his lap. Caleb clutching a toy fire truck. And then the later photos, the ones Holt remembered most. School portraits retouched into black and white for the missing flyers, laminated and posted in shop windows until the ink bled in the rain. 25 years had passed. The children should be grown, the parents gray. Yet the family in those pages looked identical to the one Holt had spoken to yesterday. He rubbed his eyes. His coffee had gone cold hours ago. When he looked up again, he realized someone was standing behind him. Detective Holt? It was Pastor Gregory. The same man who had presided over the Dawson vigil in '95. His hair had thinned since then, but his eyes were sharp. "I heard you were back on this case," Gregory said quietly, "and that you went inside the house." Holt shut off the microfilm machine. "Word travels fast." Gregory's gaze darkened. "Did you see them?" Holt hesitated. "I saw a family inside. I can't comment further." Gregory pulled out a chair and sat heavily. "I don't know what you believe, Detective, but I buried Elaine's mother myself. I stood by her grave when she begged God to tell her where her daughter was. If Elaine is standing in that house today, it isn't the same Elaine who disappeared." "You think they're imposters?" Holt asked. "I think there's something worse." Gregory's voice dropped. "In the Bible, there are stories of spirits that mimic, shadows that wear familiar faces. They look right, but they aren't right. You've seen it, haven't you?" Holt exhaled slowly. He wanted to dismiss it, to cling to the solid ground of evidence and fact. But last night, through Evelyn's blinds, the family had stood too still, too long, like figures trapped in a photograph. "Thank you, Pastor," Holt said, standing. "I'll keep that in mind." By Friday, the Dawsons were everywhere. The local paper ran a headline: "Return of the Dawsons. Police investigating." Talk radio speculated wildly. Witness protection, cult involvement, experimental medicine. A popular true crime YouTuber uploaded a 20-minute video titled "The Family That Returned from the Dead." Crowds gathered on Maple Street. People brought cameras, stood across the street, shouted questions. Some held signs, "We missed you" and "Welcome home." Others weren't so welcoming. "Imposters, go home." The Dawsons ignored them. They moved in and out of their home like any family. Elaine carried groceries from her car. Thomas mowed the lawn. The children rode their bikes up and down the driveway. Unchanged, unaged. And then came the first break. On March 23rd, Holt met with Dr. Karen Wu at the State Forensic Lab. She was the one who had processed the DNA samples from the Dawson trash. She wore her lab coat like armor and tapped her pen against the folder in front of her. "The results are consistent," she said. "The samples match the Dawson family from the 1995 records." "I read the report," Holt said, "but you asked for a meeting." "Something's bothering you." Karen nodded. "Yes, the samples are too clean. No mutations, no degradation, no irregularities you'd expect after 25 years. It's as if the DNA is frozen in time." "Could it be a lab error?" Holt asked. Karen shook her head. "We ran it 3 times. Different technicians, different machines. Same result." Holt leaned back. "So what are you telling me? That this family never aged?" Karen's pen stilled. "I'm telling you that from a genetic perspective, these people are identical to the Dawsons in 1995. Not just related, not just children of. Identical." Holt stared at her. "Clones?" Karen exhaled. "That's one theory. Another is identical twins, but that doesn't explain the children. The odds of both parents having twins, perfectly aligned to look like Anna and Caleb, are astronomically small." She closed the folder. "Detective, I don't know what's happening in Bramblewood. But if those are the Dawsons, they shouldn't exist the way they do now." That night, Holt parked down the street from the Dawson house again. The crowd had thinned, driven away by cold rain. The windows glowed softly. He raised his camera, adjusted the lens, and clicked. Through the viewfinder, the family sat around their dining table. 4 plates, 4 glasses, a roast chicken in the center. He snapped another shot, and another. On the third, his camera stuttered. The viewfinder went black. He lowered it, frowning, then looked with his naked eyes. The family was gone. The table was set, the chicken steaming, but the chairs were empty. Holt blinked. Then, in unison, all 4 Dawsons turned their heads toward the window. They hadn't been there a second ago, but now they were, staring directly at him. Evelyn Mayfield woke at 3:12 a.m. to the sound of footsteps outside her bedroom window. She held her breath, listening. The steps were slow, deliberate, circling her house. Ranger's bark echoed faintly across the street. When she finally found the courage to pull back the curtain, she saw Anna Dawson standing barefoot in the middle of her lawn. Anna's face was pale in the moonlight. She raised her hand and pressed one finger to her lips. Shh. Evelyn dropped the curtain, heart hammering. When she looked again, the lawn was empty. Detective Holt didn't sleep. He sat in his car until dawn broke pale and cold over Bramblewood, staring at the Dawson house. His camera lay on the passenger seat, the last image still frozen on its digital screen. 4 faces turned toward him, 2 still, 2 perfect. At sunrise, the curtain shifted. Elaine Dawson appeared at the window, her hand brushing the fabric aside. She didn't look surprised to see him there. She only looked tired. When Holt blinked, she was gone. He drove to the station. The chief was waiting in his office. "Sit," he said. His voice was gravelly, heavy with unspoken things. "We need to talk." Holt, Saturday. "We've got a problem," the chief continued. "The Dawsons have hired an attorney. A good one. They're claiming harassment. Say you've been staking out their house? I have," Holt admitted. The chief's jaw clenched. "Aaron, I know what you've seen. I know it doesn't make sense. But unless you can prove they're not who they say they are, my hands are tied. We can't keep treating this like an open investigation. The case is 25 years cold. There's no crime." "No crime." Holt's voice rose. "A family vanishes for a quarter century, then walks back in unchanged, and you want me to ignore it?" The chief leaned forward. "I'm telling you to tread carefully. The town's eating itself alive over this. Half believe it's a miracle, half think it's a scam. If we mishandle it, we'll have riots in the streets." Holt bit back his anger. "So what do you want me to do? Smile and wave." "Find proof," the chief said simply. "Something undeniable. Until then, keep it quiet. And Holt." He hesitated. "Don't go into that house again. Not without backup. There's something wrong in there. I can feel it." Holt ignored him. That afternoon, he knocked on Evelyn Mayfield's door. She answered quickly, eyes shadowed, hair pulled into a frayed bun. "You saw her, didn't you?" she whispered before he even spoke. "Who?" "Anna." Evelyn's hands trembled as she clutched the doorknob. "She was in my yard last night. She told me to be quiet." Holt studied her pale face. "Why didn't you call me?" "I was afraid. If I told anyone she'd come back." Evelyn's voice cracked. "Detective, that girl hasn't aged a day. She looked exactly the same as the last time I saw her in 1995. "Did anyone else see?" Evelyn shook her head. "But I know what I saw." Holt glanced across the street. The Dawson house was quiet, blinds drawn. "I believe you," he said softly. Evelyn exhaled in relief, as if she had been holding her breath for weeks. "Then you'll help me? You'll make them leave?" "I'll find the truth," Holt promised. "But you have to trust me. Don't confront them. Don't speak to them alone. Understand?" Evelyn nodded quickly. That night, Holt decided to test them. He parked farther down Maple Street and waited until the neighborhood quieted. Around 11 o'clock, he slipped into the Dawson yard. The grass was wet with dew, muffling his steps. Through the kitchen window, he saw Thomas Dawson washing dishes. The man's movements were slow, mechanical, like someone acting a part. Beside him, Elaine dried plates with a dish towel, her face expressionless. Holt crouched beneath the window, camera ready. He snapped a photo. This time, the camera didn't stutter. The image was clear. Thomas and Elaine, mid-task, as ordinary as any suburban couple. Then something changed. The air around him grew heavy, pressing against his chest. His ears rang. The kitchen lights flickered. When he lifted the camera again, the Dawsons weren't washing dishes anymore. They were staring out the window, staring down at him. Holt froze. His pulse thundered in his ears. Neither of them moved. Neither blinked. They simply watched him, their faces pale and smooth as porcelain. And then, slowly, Thomas raised his hand and tapped the glass. 3 steady beats. Holt stumbled backward, nearly dropping the camera. The air lightened. The light steadied. When he looked again, the Dawsons were gone. The kitchen was empty. The next morning, Holt reviewed the photos. The first image showed Thomas washing dishes, Elaine drying. Normal. The second showed the same, except both figures were blurred, faces smudged, as if the lens had failed to catch them. But it hadn't. Holt's hands were steady, his equipment reliable. The blur was unnatural, a distortion in the air itself. He printed the photos and pinned them above his desk. Proof. Not enough to convince the chief, maybe, but enough to keep going. He needed another angle. On Saturday, he visited the county archives. The records room smelled of dust and mold, rows of boxes stacked to the ceiling. He searched until he found the box labeled Dawson, 1995 to 1996. Inside were police reports, photographs, statements. He flipped through quickly, searching for anomalies. One report stopped him cold. October 23, 1995. Officer's statement. Witness claims to have seen the Dawson children in town 2 weeks after disappearance. Report dismissed as unreliable due to witness intoxication. The witness's name, Micah Rowe. Holt sat back, heart racing. He remembered Micah, a quiet mechanic who lived on the edge of town. He had died in 2001. Car accident, if memory served. But if Micah had seen the children 2 weeks after the disappearance, maybe the Dawsons had never left Bramblewood at all. Maybe they had been hiding in plain sight. That evening, Holt drove to the old Rowe property. The house was abandoned. Windows boarded, weeds curling up through the cracked driveway. He stepped inside. The air smelled of mildew and rodent droppings. Most of the furniture was gone, but in the basement he found a workbench covered in dusty papers. Among them was a notebook, its pages warped from water damage. The handwriting was jagged, desperate. Saw the kids again today. Same faces, same voices. They don't change. They don't sleep. I told the police, but they don't believe me. Something's wrong with that family. They're not who they say they are. Holt closed the notebook with shaking hands. Outside, dusk had fallen. He looked back toward Maple Street. The Dawson house stood in silhouette, its windows glowing faintly. For the first time, Holt wondered if Pastor Gregory was right. Maybe this wasn't a case. Maybe it was something older, something darker. The call came just after midnight. Evelyn Mayfield's voice was frantic, barely coherent. "They're in my house! Detective, they're inside!" The line went dead. Holt grabbed his coat and his gun. When he reached Maple Street, Evelyn's front door was wide open, swinging in the wind. The lights were on. The living room was empty. On the carpet lay Evelyn's phone, screen cracked, and beside it, a single photograph. It showed Evelyn sitting at her kitchen table, smiling stiffly. The Dawson family seated around her like honored guests. The photo was dated October 12, 1995. The night the Dawsons disappeared. Detective Holt didn't move at first. He stood in Evelyn Mayfield's doorway, staring at the photograph on the floor. His chest tightened as he forced himself to pick it up. The glossy paper trembled in his hand. The image was wrong. Not just because it was impossible. Evelyn smiling at a table with a family who had supposedly vanished that very night, but because of the details. The wallpaper behind them wasn't the current soft cream. It was the gaudy floral pattern Evelyn had ripped down in the early 2000s. The coffee mugs were the chipped ceramic set Evelyn had thrown out when her husband died. The photograph was real, and Evelyn Mayfield was gone. Holt called it in. Within 30 minutes, Maple Street swarmed with flashing lights. Officers combed through Evelyn's house, marking evidence, taking statements from the handful of neighbors who had come outside in their robes and slippers. None had seen anything. No vehicles, no strangers. Just Evelyn's porch light flicking on, and then silence. The chief arrived, his face grim. "Aaron, what the hell is this?" Holt handed him the photograph. The chief squinted at it, then swore under his breath. "Where did you get this?" "On the floor," Holt said. "When I arrived, the house was open. No sign of Evelyn." The chief rubbed his forehead. "We'll put out an alert." "But Holt," his voice dropped, "do not tell anyone about that picture. Not yet. If this gets out, we'll have hysteria." Holt didn't argue. He knew hysteria was already here. By dawn, Evelyn's house was sealed off with the yellow tape. Holt drove home but didn't enter. He sat in his car, staring at the empty street. His exhaustion pressed down like lead. He closed his eyes, intending to rest just for a moment. When he opened them, the world had shifted. His windshield was fogged from the inside. The clock on the dashboard read 2 a.m., though he could swear it had been nearly 7. And standing in the middle of the street was Anna Dawson. She wore a pale nightgown, bare feet on the asphalt, hair limp around her face. She stared directly at him, her lips moving soundlessly. Holt scrambled for the door handle, but when he stepped out, the street was empty. Only the lingering echo of a child's voice, soft, pleading, remained in the air. The next day, Pastor Gregory called. "I need to show you something," he said. His voice was taut with urgency. "Come to the church." Holt hesitated. The pastor unnerved him. But Evelyn's disappearance had rattled him enough to grasp at any thread. The church basement was dim, lined with filing cabinets and boxes. Pastor Gregory unlocked one and withdrew a folder yellowed with age. "These are from the 1970s, he said. "Long before you came here. Back then, another family lived on Maple Street. The Cunninghams, husband, wife, 2 children. Good church-going people. One night they vanished. No struggle, no trace. Just gone." He spread the papers across the table. Police reports, grainy photographs, a newspaper clipping. Holt skimmed the headlines. "Cunningham family missing. No leads." "What does this have to do with the Dawsons?" he asked. Gregory's eyes gleamed. "Look closely." Holt lifted one of the photographs. The Cunningham daughter stared back at him. Dark hair, solemn eyes, a pale ribbon tied at her throat. She looked almost identical to Anna Dawson. Holt's skin prickled. "Coincidence?" Gregory shook his head. "It's not coincidence. It's repetition. Every 25 years, Maple Street loses a family, and then—" He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "They come back. The same faces. Unchanged." Holt shoved the photo aside. "You're telling me this is— what? A curse?" "I'm telling you what the records show," Gregory said. "The Dawsons are not the first. And if we don't act, they won't be the last." That night, Holt dreamed. He was standing in Evelyn's kitchen. The Dawson family sat around the table, smiling stiffly, their hands folded. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. Anna turned to him. "Come sit with us," she whispered. When he refused, her smile widened, stretching too far, teeth too sharp. He woke drenched in sweat, the echo of her voice still in his ears. On Monday, the chief called him in. "Sit down, Holt. I've got bad news." He slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a coroner's report. "Body pulled from the river this morning," the chief said. "Female, mid-60s. Matched dental records, Holt's stomach turned. Evelyn?" The chief nodded. "Cause of death? Drowning. But here's the strange part. No sign of struggle, no defensive wounds. It's like she walked into the water willingly. Holt closed the folder, bile rising in his throat. She didn't, he said. They took her. The chief's jaw tightened. Aaron, you're chasing shadows. Don't lose yourself in this, but Holt knew better. Evelyn had been the first to see the cracks in the facade, and now she was gone. He left the station, the photograph burning in his pocket. The Dawson house loomed in his mind, its windows like blank eyes watching him from across town. Something was happening on Maple Street, and he was running out of time to stop it. Detective Holt drove past the Dawson house 3 times before he forced himself to stop. The blinds were drawn tight. No movement, no sound. The lawn was neatly mowed, the hedges trimmed, as if nothing inside the house could possibly be wrong. But Evelyn Mayfield was in the river. Holt parked 2 houses down and walked. The spring air was warm, but his hands were cold, his pulse quickening with each step. He knocked on the Dawsons' door. It opened almost immediately. Elaine Dawson stood there, her expression polite but guarded, as though she had expected him. Detective Holt, she said evenly. How can we help you? Behind her, Holt glimpsed the family seated at the kitchen table. Thomas at the head, Michael and Anna on either side. Their plates were full of food, roast chicken, potatoes, green beans. Not one of them lifted a fork. I'd like to ask you some questions, Holt said. Elaine hesitated, then opened the door wider. Of course. Come in. The house smelled faintly of lemon polish, the kind used to mask something older, something stale. Please, Thomas said, rising to shake Holt's hand. His palm was cool, his grip too firm. Sit with us. Holt declined the seat, remaining by the doorway. His gaze swept the room. The spotless counters, the tidy shelves, the family frozen around the table. Where were you last night? Holt asked. Elaine blinked. Home, of course. Why? Evelyn Mayfield drowned in the river, Holt said. He watched their faces carefully. Anna tilted her head, eyes wide. That's sad, she said softly. We liked Mrs. Mayfield. Michael nodded. She used to give us cookies. Holt's breath caught. His voice hardened. When? She hasn't baked cookies for anyone since the 90s. Neither child flinched. They only looked at him with calm, steady eyes. Elaine folded her hands neatly. Detective, are you accusing us of something? I'm saying, Holt replied, that Evelyn is dead. And I found a photograph of her with you. Dated the night you disappeared. Thomas's smile didn't waver, but his eyes sharpened. That's impossible. Is it? Holt pressed. Do you want to explain how Evelyn ended up at your table in 1995? Silence. The children stared. Elaine's knuckles whitened where she gripped her napkin. Finally, Thomas spoke. Detective, I think you should go. Holt didn't move. Not until you tell me the truth. Thomas stepped forward, close enough that Holt could smell the faint metallic tang on his breath. The truth, he said quietly, is that you don't belong here. Not anymore. For a moment, Holt thought he saw something ripple beneath Thomas's skin, a shimmer like heat rising from asphalt. Then it was gone. The family watched him in perfect stillness. Holt's instincts screamed. He backed toward the door. We'll talk again, he said, his voice steady though his heart hammered. Of course, Elaine murmured. We'll be here. Outside, Holt filled his lungs with fresh air, but it didn't clear the dread. He drove straight to the station and spread the photographs across his desk. The blurred image of the Dawsons, Evelyn's impossible snapshot, the Cunningham girl from the 1970s who looked too much like Anna. Patterns, echoes, repetition. He scrawled on his notepad. Not aging, not human, parasites, copies. He didn't know what he was fighting. Only that it had taken Evelyn, and if he waited too long, it would take more. The next night, Holt dreamed again. He was standing at the edge of the river. Evelyn floated face down in the water, her gray hair streaming around her. When he waded in to pull her out, her head lifted. Her eyes were wide open, lips moving. "They'll keep replacing us," she whispered. "Family after family after family." Holt woke with a gasp, the sheets damp with sweat. He couldn't ignore it anymore. He returned to the archives, digging deeper. Midnight passed, then 1, then 2. Finally, he found what he hadn't known he was searching for. A thin folder, misfiled beneath land records. Inside were photographs from 1950. Black and white, grainy but clear enough. Another family on Maple Street. The Harrisons. 4 faces. A father, a mother, 2 children. The daughter's eyes caught him, wide, solemn, framed by a pale ribbon. Holt closed his eyes. It was Anna. Again, same face, same age, different name. He turned the photo over, scrawled on the back. "Harrison's missing, house empty. 1950, 3 families, 70 years, always the same." Holt drove home at dawn, the folder on the seat beside him. As he pulled into his driveway, a figure stood at his door. Anna Dawson. She wore the same nightgown as before, white and thin, her bare feet pale against the concrete. She raised her hand in a small wave. Then she vanished. Holt stumbled inside, heart pounding, and bolted the door. On his kitchen table lay a photograph he hadn't left there. It showed Holt himself, sitting at the Dawsons' table, hands folded, a stiff smile on his face. The date at the bottom, October 12th, 1995. Detective Holt didn't go to work the next morning. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at the photograph that should not exist. His own face frozen in time, seated at the Dawsons' dinner table in 1995. His chest ached with exhaustion, but his mind would not stop. There were only 2 possibilities. Either the Dawsons had staged the photo somehow, manipulating old film stock to torment him, or he pressed his palms against his eyes, unwilling to finish the thought. The knock on his door came softly. 3 taps. Just like Thomas Dawson had tapped the glass. Holt's hand went to his pistol before he opened the door. It wasn't Thomas. It was Anna. She stood barefoot on his porch, clutching the hem of her nightgown, her eyes huge and solemn. "Detective," she whispered, "I don't want to be here anymore." Holt stepped aside reluctantly, letting her in. She smelled faintly of river water and something sweet, like spoiled fruit. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the couch. She obeyed, folding her hands in her lap with a child's precision. Yet her gaze was too sharp, her composure too practiced. "You said you don't want to be here," Holt prompted. "Here where?" "With them," Anna whispered. Her voice shook. "They make us stay. They make us smile. They say we're a family, but we're not." Holt's skin prickled. "Then what are you?" Anna's lips trembled. She leaned closer, as though afraid the walls might hear. "Copies. Made from the ones who went before. Every time they make us again." Holt's throat tightened. "Who makes you?" She shook her head violently. "If I tell you, they'll know." "Then why come here?" he asked, her eyes filled with tears that did not fall. "Because you're next." Before Holt could speak, the room darkened. The lights flickered once, twice. The air grew heavy, pressing against his ribs. Anna's expression changed. Her lips stretched into a smile too wide for her face. "They're here," she whispered. The window shattered inward. Holt dropped, drawing his pistol. Glass rained across the floor. Through the shards, a figure climbed. Thomas Dawson, his face expressionless, his hand steady as if the broken glass didn't cut him at all. Elaine appeared behind him, stepping carefully through the wreckage. "Anna," she said calmly. "Come home." Anna sat perfectly still, her smile frozen, eyes locked on Holt. "Detective," Thomas said, voice low, "this isn't your fight." Holt aimed his pistol. "Stay where you are." Neither flinched. "You can't stop this," Thomas said. "It's bigger than you. It's older than all of us." He reached for Anna's arm. She rose mechanically, the tears gone from her face, smile still fixed. Holt fired. The bullet struck Thomas in the shoulder. He staggered but did not bleed. His smile widened, and for the first time Holt saw the ripple beneath his skin, a shimmer, a distortion, like a reflection on disturbed water. Elaine stepped forward. "Enough," she said. Her voice deepened, vibrating in Holt's bones. "You'll join us soon." "Don't fight what's already decided." Holt fired again. The bullet punched through her torso. She didn't even stumble. Then the lights flared white, blinding. When Holt blinked his vision clear, the Dawsons were gone. Only the broken window remained, the night air cold against his face. Anna's impression lingered in the couch cushions. Holt didn't sleep. He boarded the window, packed his evidence into boxes, and left his house before dawn. He couldn't stay there, not with them able to come and go at will. He drove aimlessly until he found himself outside the hospital. Micah Rowe's name surfaced in his mind, the man who had claimed to see the Dawson children in 1995. Dead nearly 20 years, but maybe someone still alive had known him. The records clerk was tired but cooperative. Within an hour, Holt held Micah's medical files, notes from therapy sessions, observations of paranoia, scribbled warnings in the margins. They live in reflections. They step out when the mirror is ready. Holt's hand shook. He remembered the shimmer under Thomas's skin. Maybe Micah hadn't been paranoid at all. That evening, Holt parked down the block from Maple Street. He watched the Dawson house until the sun slipped away. The lights flicked on, room by room, until the whole house glowed. Shadows moved across the curtains. At exactly 9 o'clock, the front door opened. The Dawsons stepped out, dressed in their Sunday best. Thomas in a suit, Elaine in a blue dress, Michael with a tie too tight, Anna with her ribbon. They walked down the driveway and stood at the curb, motionless as though waiting for something. Holt raised his camera. The air around them rippled. One by one, duplicates stepped out. Exact copies, identical faces, identical clothes. 4 Dawsons became 8, then 12, then 16. Each pair of eyes lifted toward Holt's hiding place. He lowered the camera, bile rising in his throat. This wasn't a family. It was a factory, and it had been running on Maple Street for generations. Detective Holt knew he couldn't keep circling the Dawson house forever. Every night, the duplications multiplied. He had counted 22 at one point, rows of identical Dawsons standing in the streetlight like mannequins. They never spoke, never moved, only stared toward the watching world. And then, as if someone had flipped a switch, they would vanish, leaving the street empty once more. It was a performance, a message, and Holt was the audience. By Thursday night, he made his choice. He would go inside. He prepared as if for war. 2 cameras, extra batteries, a body mic connected to a recorder strapped under his jacket. His service weapon, loaded and cleaned. A flask of holy water Pastor Gregory had pressed into his hand, murmuring prayers. Holt didn't believe in blessings, but he was desperate enough to carry it. The street was quiet when he parked, the air thick with the silence that had become Maple Street's signature after dark. Neighbors no longer peeked from windows. They stayed away from their blinds, pretending not to hear the footsteps and whispers outside. The Dawson house loomed at the end of the block, windows glowing faintly. Holt crossed the lawn. His boots sank into damp earth. His hand tightened on the gun. He didn't knock. He turned the doorknob. It opened without resistance. The air inside was warm, stale. The lemon scent was gone. The living room sat in perfect order. Couch, armchair, photographs on the mantel. But something was wrong. The photographs had changed. No longer the Dawsons smiling at holidays or birthdays. Now they showed strangers. Families Holt didn't recognize, frozen in black and white, then in fading Polaroid, then in glossy color. Families from every decade, their clothes shifting with the years. In each, the children were always the same. The girl with the braid, the boy with the toy. Anna and Michael, over and over. Holt's stomach lurched. He lifted one frame. The back bore a neat inscription, "The Harrisons, 1950. He set it down carefully, his hands trembling. A sound echoed from deeper in the house, a low, rhythmic thud, like machinery. Holt followed it. The basement door stood ajar. He descended slowly, the wooden steps groaning under his weight. The thudding grew louder, accompanied by a faint hum. The basement smelled of damp concrete and iron. In the center stood a machine, or something that looked like one. Wires snaked across the floor, pulsing faintly as though alive. Glass cylinders lined the walls, filled with a murky liquid. Inside each cylinder floated a shape. Children, some with half-formed faces, their features blurred like unfinished clay. Some perfectly clear, eyes shut, hair drifting in the liquid. Anna, Michael, dozens of them. Holt staggered back, bile rising in his throat. His flashlight beam shook. One of the children's eyes opened. Holt dropped the light. It clattered across the floor. From the shadows, a voice whispered, "Detective!" He turned, gun raised. Elaine Dawson stood at the foot of the stairs, her dress immaculate, her face serene. Behind her, Thomas appeared, blocking the exit. "You weren't invited," Elaine said softly. "What is this?" Holt demanded. His voice cracked. "What are you doing to those children?" Elaine tilted her head. "Preservation, renewal. Families fade, families die, but we keep them whole." "They're copies," Holt spat. "Empty shells." Elaine's smile widened. "Are you so sure? Look at them. They laugh, they play, they remember. Isn't that enough?" Thomas stepped closer. His skin rippled in the flashlight's beam. "You've seen what happens when families vanish. Grief, anguish. The world tears itself apart. We spare them that. We bring them back." Holt's finger tightened on the trigger. "That's not bringing them back. That's puppetry." Thomas's eyes flashed. "You'll understand soon." He raised his hand. The hum in the basement deepened. The cylinders vibrated, liquid churning. Faces pressed against the glass, lips moving silently. Holt backed toward the far wall, his heart hammering. He thought of Evelyn's photograph, of her stiff smile, her hands folded at the Dawson table. He thought of Anna whispering, "Because you're next." "Not me," Holt said through clenched teeth. He fired. The bullet struck the nearest cylinder. Glass shattered, liquid gushing across the floor. A child's body spilled onto the concrete, limp and pale. The hum rose into a shriek. Lights burst overhead. Elaine's smile broke. "You shouldn't have done that." The remaining cylinders began to crack. One by one, the duplicates inside opened their eyes. Holt fled. He barreled up the stairs, shoving past Thomas, who barely staggered as though his body were made of something heavier than flesh. The living room blurred around him. He crashed through the front door into the night air, lungs burning, vision swimming. Behind him, the Dawson house trembled. Curtains fluttered, windows rattled. A low moan rose from the foundation, a sound like the house itself was alive. The neighbors stayed hidden. No one opened their doors. Holt didn't stop running until he reached his car. He slammed the door, jammed the keys into the ignition, and sped away. Heart pounding, headlights slicing through the dark. When he finally dared to look in the rearview mirror, he saw the Dawson house standing perfectly still, its windows dark, as if nothing had ever happened. He pulled into the church parking lot just before dawn. Pastor Gregory was already waiting, as if he'd known Holt would come. "You went inside," the pastor said. Not a question. Holt's voice was raw. "They're making them. Over and over. The children, the families. God help me, I saw them in glass tanks." Gregory's face was pale, his jaw clenched. "It's worse than I thought." "Worse!" Holt snapped. "How does it get worse than that?" Gregory's gaze was steady. "Because it never ends. When one family fades, they make another. They've been doing it for generations, and now they've marked you." Holt's hands shook. He thought of the photograph on his table, his own face among the Dawsons. The pastor's words hung in the air like a verdict. "They won't stop until you're one of them." Detective Holt didn't remember falling asleep in the church basement, only the cold stone beneath his cheek when he woke. Pastor Gregory sat across from him, the first rays of dawn filtering through a narrow window above. "Dreams?" the pastor asked quietly. Holt rubbed his eyes. "Worse than that." He didn't describe the visions. Rows of glass cylinders, faces pressing against the glass, voices chanting his name. He didn't describe how, in the dream, he had reached out and touched the surface, and his own reflection had smiled back at him with the Dawson family's eyes. Instead, he said, "How long has this been happening?" Gregory exhaled. "The records go back to the 1800s. Families moving to Bramblewood, settling on Maple Street, disappearing without a trace. The names change, the faces don't. Always a mother, father, 2 children, always a dog." Holt's stomach twisted. "So what are they? Clones? Some kind of experiment?" The pastor's gaze was steady. "Some things aren't science, Detective. Some things are older. My grandmother used to tell stories about places where the world was thin, where something on the other side pressed through. It would take what it found and send it back, hollowed out." But smiling, Holt clenched his jaw. "That's superstition. Then explain what you saw." Holt had no answer. By noon, Holt was back at the police station. The chief avoided his eyes. Evelyn's death had rattled the department, though officially it was written up as accidental drowning. Holt knew better. He pulled out the photographs again. The Dawsons, the Cunninghams, the Harrisons. Generations of families, repeating like a pattern stamped into the earth itself, every 25 years. He checked the calendar. It was 2020. The Dawsons had disappeared in 1995, exactly 25 years. The cycle was continuing. That evening, Holt returned to Maple Street. He couldn't stay away. The house looked ordinary in daylight. Children's bikes leaned against the porch. A wind chime tinkled softly in the breeze. For a moment, Holt could almost believe it was real, that the Dawsons were simply a family who had gone missing and come home. But then he saw the girl. Anna stood in the upstairs window, hands pressed against the glass. Her mouth moved soundlessly, over and over, the same phrase. Holt raised his camera, zoomed in. Her lips spelled, "Help me." His chest tightened. He lowered the camera, but when he looked again, she was gone. He went back to the archives that night, hungry for something he could use. In a box mislabeled with zoning records, he found a map of Bramblewood dated 1912. Maple Street wasn't Maple Street then. It was listed as Chapel Road. At its end stood a building marked only as Meeting House. Holt traced the lines with his finger. The meeting house sat exactly where the Dawson home stood now. He searched further. Minutes from town meetings in 1913. Complaint filed regarding disturbances at the meeting house. Lights at night. Unusual sounds. Several families relocated. Building later demolished. Except it hadn't been demolished. It had been buried, and on its foundation, Maple Street had been built. The following day, Holt confronted Gregory with the map. "Your church knew about this," he said. Gregory didn't deny it. His face was grave. The meeting house wasn't a church. It was a gathering place for people who studied things better left buried. They believed they could capture what lived beyond the veil, bind it to this place, make it serve them. And it worked, Holt said flatly. Gregory nodded. Too well. The house on Maple Street isn't just a home, Detective. It's a vessel. Families move in, and the thing inside reshapes them, repeats them, until nothing of them is left. Holt's throat tightened. So the Dawsons I saw, they're not people. Gregory's eyes darkened. They're echoes, dressed in skin. That night, Holt dreamed again. He was walking down Maple Street. The houses were silent, blinds drawn. At the end of the street, the Dawson home glowed. He stepped inside. The family waited at the table, smiling stiffly. Evelyn sat with them, her hair wet, eyes glazed. The chair at the head of the table was empty. Sit, Thomas Dawson said. When Holt refused, the walls trembled. The photographs on the wall shifted, cycling through faces, families, decades. And then, suddenly, all the frames held his own face. He woke with a shout, his sheets tangled, his skin slick with sweat. On his nightstand lay another photograph that hadn't been there before. It showed him seated at the Dawson table, his hands folded neatly. The date stamped at the bottom, April 5th, 2020. A week from now. Detective Holt stopped sleeping. Every time he closed his eyes, the Dawson house followed him. The photographs, the duplicates, his own face at their table. By Monday, he was running on coffee and stubbornness alone. His hands shook, but his focus sharpened. If he didn't act, the date stamped on that photograph, April 5th, would become his grave. He spread the evidence across the church basement table. Maps, photos, Evelyn's cracked phone, Micah Rowe's notebook. Gregory sat across from him, lips moving silently in prayer. "We can't stop it," Gregory said finally. "The families never come back. They only wear the faces. And once it marks you—" "I'm not finished yet," Holt cut in. His voice was hoarse but steady. "Every machine has a core. That thing in the basement, it runs on something. If I can find it, I can shut it down." Gregory frowned. "And if you can't, then it kills me. Either way, I don't end up at that table." That night, Holt prepared as if heading to war. His pistol, though he doubted bullets mattered. A crowbar, a satchel of accelerants from the evidence lockup, gasoline, flares, thermite charges, and Gregory's flask of holy water, though Holt still wasn't sure whether he carried it out of belief or desperation. At midnight, he parked on Maple Street. The neighborhood was silent. The Dawson house glowed, steady as a lighthouse. He crossed the lawn. The air grew thick, pressing down on his chest. His ears rang faintly. The front door was unlocked, waiting. The house greeted him with silence. The living room looked ordinary. Couch, lamp, photographs on the walls. But the photographs had shifted again. This time they showed him, dozens of copies of himself, smiling stiffly beside the Dawson family. Holt forced himself past them and headed for the basement. The door groaned open. The hum rose to meet him, low and alive. He descended slowly, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the dark. The cylinders were still there, lining the walls, but more were cracked now. Some lay shattered, liquid drying on the floor. Empty glass. And in the center of the room stood something new, a shape like a mirror, tall and narrow, its surface rippling like liquid silver. Faces shifted across it: Thomas, Elaine, Anna, Michael, Evelyn, the Cunninghams, the Harrisons, and then his own. Holt's stomach dropped. The mirror smiled at him. He raised the pistol and fired. The bullet struck the surface, sending ripples across the liquid, but it did not break. The smile widened. "Detective," a voice whispered from the mirror. It was his voice. "You can't fight what you are." The basement door slammed shut. Holt spun, gun raised. The Dawsons stood at the top of the stairs. 4 of them, then 8, then 12. Their faces multiplied in the flickering light, spilling down the steps in perfect unison. "You belong with us," Thomas said. His voice echoed, layered with dozens more. "You've always belonged." Holt gritted his teeth. He pulled the satchel open, yanked out a flare. "You want me?" he snarled. "Come get me." He lit the flare. Red fire roared to life, throwing shadows against the basement walls. The mirror rippled violently. The faces inside screamed. The Dawsons hesitated, their smiles cracked. Holt hurled the flare into the nearest cylinder. The glass exploded, liquid rushing across the floor. The duplicates wailed, their forms flickering, their edges blurring. He yanked the thermite charge from the bag, struck the fuse, and hurled it at the base of the mirror. White fire erupted. The hum rose to a shriek, shaking the foundation. The Dawsons screamed in unison, their bodies rippling like reflections in shattered glass. Holt staggered back, shielding his eyes. The mirror convulsed, the silver surface boiling. Faces stretched, melted, dissolved. Then came silence. The mirror collapsed into shards of blackened glass. The cylinders cracked, spilling their contents onto the floor. The Dawsons were gone. Holt stumbled up the stairs into the night air. Smoke poured from the basement windows. Flames licked the curtains. The Dawson house burned, bright and hot, sparks rising into the night sky. Neighbors poured from their homes, shouting, pointing. Sirens wailed in the distance. Holt leaned against his car, chest heaving. For the first time in weeks, the weight lifted from his lungs. The Dawsons were gone. The cycle was broken. Or so he thought. As firefighters battled the blaze, Holt stood back, watching. The house collapsed inward, beams crashing into sparks. And in the crowd of neighbors, he saw her, Anna. She stood barefoot on the curb, nightgown pale in the firelight, her braid hanging over one shoulder. She smiled at him. Then she vanished. Holt's hands shook. His chest went cold. Because when the flames roared higher, he saw something glinting in the wreckage. Unburned, untouched. A shard of the mirror, its surface still rippling faintly, as though waiting. Detective Holt didn't remember driving home. One moment he was watching the Dawson house collapse into fire, neighbors shouting, sirens blaring. The next, he was sitting at his kitchen table, hands clenched around a mug of cold coffee, staring at the blank wall. The shard was still in his car trunk. He hadn't told anyone. Not the firefighters, not the other detectives, not even Gregory. He should have left it. He should have let it burn. But when he saw it glinting through the flames, something inside him moved, like a hook pulling a fish. His body had acted before his mind caught up. Now it sat wrapped in an old towel, humming faintly like a machine left on. He could feel it through the walls. By Tuesday morning, Holt forced himself back into routine. He shaved, he showered. He went to the station. The fire marshal called it a gas leak. Reporters swarmed the site, eager for a story about the infamous vanishing family house finally destroyed. Everyone wanted to believe it was over, but Holt knew better. The shard was still alive. And so, in some way, were the Dawsons. Gregory found him in the church that evening, kneeling before the altar. Holt hadn't prayed in years, but the words came out of him like a wound reopening. "Do you think it's over?" Holt asked when Gregory sat beside him. Gregory looked at him closely. "You don't believe it is?" Holt hesitated. "I found something." In the fire, a piece of it, Gregory's face drained of color. "You kept it?" "I couldn't leave it there." "You don't understand," Gregory whispered. "It doesn't die in fire. It doesn't die at all. You've invited it in that night," Holt dreamed. He stood in the Dawson living room. Only now it was his living room. His furniture, his photos on the walls. But the photos had changed. They showed him at the table with a family that wasn't his, a wife, 2 children, smiling, eyes dark, skin waxen. "Sit with us," Thomas Dawson's voice whispered. Holt woke gasping, sweat slick on his skin. The shard hummed from the trunk, louder than ever. By Wednesday, he couldn't resist. He drove out to the edge of town, to the old limestone quarry where kids spray-painted the rocks and drank cheap beer. He parked by the cliff, opened the trunk, and unwrapped the shard. It gleamed faintly, even in the afternoon sun, its surface rippling like mercury. Holt lifted it in both hands and saw his reflection. Only it wasn't just his reflection. Behind him stood Evelyn, behind her Anna, their faces pressed close, smiling too wide. He dropped the shard, but it didn't fall. It hovered in the air, humming. "Detective," Evelyn's voice whispered from its surface, "you can't erase what's written." Holt staggered back, heart hammering. "You're not real." But Anna stepped closer within the glass, her hand pressing to the surface. And when Holt looked down, his own hand was rising to meet hers. The shard pulsed, the air vibrating. Holt heard voices, hundreds, layered, whispering, chanting. His knees buckled. And then, silence. The shard dropped, clattering to the ground. Its surface went dark. Holt bent to pick it up, but froze, because the reflection staring back at him wasn't his own. It was smiling. He wrapped the shard again, shoving it deep in the satchel, heart pounding. He knew then that burning the house had changed nothing. The cycle hadn't been broken. It had only scattered. And now part of it belonged to him. Back at home, Holt taped the satchel shut and shoved it into the crawl space beneath his floorboards. Out of sight, if not out of mind. Then he sat at the table, staring at the blank wall again, until his phone rang. It was Gregory. His voice shook. "They've found another house," Gregory whispered. "In Oklahoma this time. Same story. A family gone 20 years. And last night, the neighbors swore they saw them through the windows." Holt closed his eyes. The shard hummed faintly beneath the floorboards. It was spreading, and it wasn't finished with him. Detective Holt knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. The shard was calling. By Thursday night, the hum beneath his floorboards had grown louder, like a generator hidden inside his walls. His lights flickered, his radio whispered voices when it wasn't plugged in, and the photos in his apartment had changed. He stared at the one of his police academy graduation. It should have shown him with his class, grinning in their pressed uniforms. Instead, the others were gone, replaced. 4 strangers stood at his side: Thomas, Elaine, Anna, and Michael Dawson, all smiling. He tore the photo down and ripped it in half. The hum only grew louder. At midnight, he dug the shard out of the crawl space and drove. He didn't know where he was going until the road signs pointed toward Oklahoma. Bramblewood wasn't unique. Gregory had been right. The Dawsons weren't alone. Somewhere, another house had lit up. Another family had returned, and Holt couldn't let it grow unchecked. He followed the address Gregory had whispered, a farmhouse on the outskirts of Stillwater. It stood alone in the wheat fields, pale and ordinary, yet every window blazed with light. Holt parked 100 yards out. The shard pulsed in the passenger seat, its glow leaking through the towel. For a moment, he considered turning back. Let someone else handle it. Let the world fall into whatever abyss it was sliding toward. But then he thought of Evelyn, of Anna, of all the faces pressed against the glass, begging, smiling, and he knew it had already chosen him. He carried the shard across the field. The wheat bent toward him as he walked, whispering like dry voices. The farmhouse door was open. Inside, the air was warm, thick, alive. The hum reverberated through the walls, shaking dust from the rafters. And there they were, a family of 4, seated at the kitchen table, hands folded, eyes locked on him. "Welcome home," the father said. His voice was Thomas Dawson's voice. His face was wrong, too smooth, too bright. But it was close enough. Holt lifted the shard. It pulsed, eager, hungry. The family smiled wider. "Sit with us," the mother said. The shard tugged at him, pulling his arm forward. His knees weakened. His chest ached as though invisible hands were pressing him down into the chair waiting at the table. He thought of the photographs, of his face sitting among them. And he realized with sudden clarity, the shard didn't want to destroy him. It wanted to replace him. It wanted him to become part of the cycle. "No," Holt whispered. He drew the crowbar from his belt and swung. The shard cracked. Light burst from it, spilling across the walls in searing waves. The family screamed in unison, their faces warping, melting like wax. Holt struck again. The shard shattered into 3 jagged pieces. The hum spiked to a shriek that shook the farmhouse foundations. The family lunged at him, mouths stretched too wide, eyes black as ink. Holt hurled the shards into the air and fired his pistol. Bullets struck glass. The pieces exploded, raining silver dust. The screams cut off. The family froze. Their bodies convulsed, then collapsed into heaps of clothing and bone. Empty shells. The farmhouse went silent. Holt staggered into the night, lungs burning. The wheat swayed violently, then stilled. In the distance, the farmhouse glowed faintly, then crumbled inward, timbers snapping like bones. By dawn, only smoke rose from the field. Holt leaned against his car, staring east as the sky paled. The shards were gone. The hum was gone. But deep inside, in the silence between heartbeats, he thought he heard something else. Not gone, not destroyed. Waiting. The sun crested the horizon. Holt slid into his car and started the engine. He didn't drive back to Bramblewood. He didn't drive back to the station. He drove on, past the fields, past the towns, past the people who still believed their homes were safe. Because he knew the truth now. There would be another house, another family, another face smiling from behind glass. And until he was gone, it would never stop looking for him. A year later, Bramblewood had rebuilt itself around absence. The Dawson house was gone, its lot smoothed into a patch of grass. Children biked past without slowing. The name was rarely spoken, but every so often, someone new moved into town, and the old stories rose again. The missing family, the house that lit up after 25 years, the detective who vanished soon after. Because Holt never came back. His apartment sat empty, his badge and gun sealed in evidence storage. His car was found at a motel outside Wichita, engine still warm, driver's door open. No one at the desk remembered seeing him, but in the room he'd rented, the mirror over the sink was cracked, and on the nightstand, left neatly in the glow of the lamp, was a photograph. It showed a family of 4, mother, father, 2 children, and at the end of the table, smiling, sat Detective Aaron Holt. The photograph was dated 3 days in the future. Fade to black.